If it's Thursday, an appeals court just paused a ruling that would have required the White House to end most of its sweeping tariffs in 10 days after the Trump administration raged against the courts for ruling the tariffs are unconstitutional. Plus, Harvard secures a legal win for now in its fight against the Trump administration as a federal judge extends her order blocking the White House from revoking the university's ability to enroll or keep international students. And Elon Musk officially exits the Trump administration, ending a turbulent tenure marked by controversies and cuts to the government that fell well below his own expectations. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker in Washington with breaking news and new developments in the White House's legal fight over its sweeping tariff agenda. Moments ago, a federal appeals court gave the administration the emergency relief it was looking for, temporarily pausing a ruling that was handed down last night by a federal trade court, which said that most of the president's tariffs on U.S. trading partners were unconstitutional and giving the White House just 10 days to unwind them all. The ruling this afternoon from the appeals court effectively reinstates those tariffs for now. Here was White House trade advisor Peter Navarro just moments after that appeals court decision.
The tariffs remain in place. The court told us, they didn't all but tell us, they told us, go do it another way. So you can assume that even if we lose, we will do it another way. And I can assure the American people that the Trump tariff agenda is alive, well, healthy, and will be implemented to protect you, to save your jobs and your factories, and to stop shipping foreign wealth, our wealth, into foreign hands.
So you are working on a plan B right now?
Of course. There's no plan B. It's plan A.
Now, it comes after the White House earlier today lashed out at the judicial branch over a series of rulings against its tariff authority, with Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt maligning the courts and trying to undermine their legitimacy as a check on the president's power.
3 judges of the U.S. Court of International Trade disagreed and brazenly abused their judicial power to usurp the authority of President Trump to stop him from carrying out the mandate that the American people gave him. The courts should have no role here. There is a troubling and dangerous trend of unelected judges inserting themselves into the presidential decision-making process. America cannot function if President Trump, or any other president for that matter, has their sensitive diplomatic or trade negotiations railroaded by activist judges.
Now, much of that ire from the White House was directed at the federal trade court for last night's ruling from a 3-judge panel that the president exceeded his authority and unconstitutionally bypassed Congress when he put in place those so-called Liberation Day tariffs last month and the fentanyl tariffs that he imposed on China. The administration then threatened to take the issue all the way to the Supreme Court if it didn't get immediate relief, arguing that allowing the ruling to stand would cause immediate, irreparable harm to the nation. Amid all this back and forth with the courts and the overall trade policy confusion on Wall Street, stocks ended the day slightly up. It comes amid another major development today that the president summoned Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell to an in-person meeting at the White House today, urging Powell to lower interest rates. The meeting prompting the Federal Reserve to put out a statement assuring the public that Chairman Powell told the president he would not bend to political pressure from the White House. I'm joined now by NBC News senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez, NBC News business and data correspondent Brian Chung, and Tim Brightbill, an attorney who specializes in international trade law and policy. Thanks to all of you for starting us off. Gabe, it's another day of breakneck developments from the courts to the stock market and Washington and beyond. We played a little bit of Peter Navarro's reaction, of course, to this latest court ruling on the Trump tariffs. But what else are your sources telling you from inside the administration about the tariff policy?
Kristen, as you described it, certainly tariff whiplash here. For the past hour or so, we've been trying to get reaction from the administration. You just heard there from Peter Navarro. And look, this is the White House is moving full speed ahead with these tariffs, and they view this temporary stay as another step in the process. Caroline Leavitt earlier today, suggesting that this fight could go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. So this is another step in the process. We just got a statement from the plaintiff's attorney in this case, stressing that this is just a temporary stay. But Peter Navarro was asked about what should small businesses take from this? All this uncertainty, all this back and forth. And he basically stressed that this is worth the pain, that the uncertainty is worth it to realign global trade. But certainly a lot of whiplash once again here at the White House. And, it's only 4 o'clock, Kristen.
It's a good point, Gabe. The administration, of course, has been in the middle of trade talks with several countries. Peter Navarro had said 90 deals in 90 days. What's the status of those negotiations? And Gabe, could this in fact limit the White House's leverage in those negotiations?
Well, some analysts are saying that, but I put that question specifically to Caroline Leavitt, the press secretary, earlier today in the White House briefing, and she said no, that that the ruling yesterday would not affect trade negotiations because the administration feels that it will win, and they are stressing that they think that the countries around the world see that. Of course, critics of the administration are skeptical of that. And by the way, Kristen, one thing I didn't mention, you spoke about earlier about how the White House was calling this 3-judge panel rogue judges. Well, President Trump, during his first term, appointed one of those judges, and there was another of the 3 appointed by President Reagan, Kristen.
Yeah, a really important point to point out there. Gabe, let me ask you about another major development at the White House today. We learned that President Trump met with Fed Chair Jerome Powell. We know for months now the president has been urging the Fed chair to lower interest rates, something that he has not done in the wake of these tariffs going into effect. What exactly is the White House saying about that meeting? And what are we hearing from the Fed chair himself, Gabe?
Well, Kristen, the president has been kind of backing off a little bit his threat to fire Jerome Powell, essentially saying he'll just wait till his term expires next year. But he has been railing on the Fed chairman for not lowering interest rates. And you read part of his statement a little earlier. I found it interesting that in that statement from the Federal Reserve, it mentioned that Chair Powell did not discuss his expectations for monetary policy with the president today here at the White House. Caroline Leavitt, though, was asked about her readout and the administration's readout of the meeting. Listen to that.
I can share with you that we saw, the president and I both saw the statement that the Fed put out after the meeting. That statement is correct. However, the president did say that he believes the Fed chair is making a mistake by not lowering interest rates, which is putting us at an economic disadvantage to China and other countries. And the president's been very vocal about that, both publicly and now I can reveal privately as well.
Kristen, what stuck out to me about that soundbite is, notice she said that the Fed chairman's statement was correct. However, basically, getting it in there that they have sharp disagreements even still after this meeting. Kristen.
Yeah, and as she said, that those disagreements have not exactly been a secret. Gabe Gutierrez, as always, thank you for your great reporting from the White House. Brian, let me head over to you. Let's look at and talk about the market reactions. They actually ended the day a bit up in the wake of all of this tariff whiplash at the courts. What do you make of that?
Yeah, if you look at the Dow action today, it wasn't anything particularly remarkable, even though the headline was a bit splashy that there would be this potential stay of these worldwide tariffs at 10%. You can see that the Dow Jones only ended the day about 0.3 positive. And obviously, there have been a number of earnings as well throughout the last few days. So it is indeed the case that, this is not, I would describe a remarkably positive day that's kind of hinged to specifically this development. And I think that's because markets are kind of shrugging off the implications of all of this, because some of the commentary is that, first off, obviously there's a legal challenge. This appeals development in just the last hour underscores how it's really far from a set done deal that these tariffs will be canceled by the legal system here in the United States. But also, even if they are, the Trump administration could just use other types of avenues, like, for example, Section 232 tariffs on specific industries to get around the current way of getting these tariffs done, but still imposing these added costs on imports coming in from other countries. So I think that's one big reason why we didn't see the stock market react more strongly to the news overnight.
Brian, one of the big words as we've watched this tariff policy unfold has been uncertainty. The uncertainty that businesses, large and small, have been dealing with, the uncertainty that Wall Street has been dealing with. Is there any more clarity after this back and forth in the courts?
Well, I don't think so. And especially if you're a small business, which, by the way, I want to point out that the legal challenge to the Trump administration's 10% blanket tariffs that were originally struck down by this court came from 5 small businesses. One of them is a New York-based wine importer. Another one is a Virginia-based electronics toy maker. So it's small businesses that are trying to figure out how to handle these tariffs. And even in just the last 18 to 19 hours, if I'm doing my math right, I think 8 p.m. yesterday Eastern time was around when we found out about this court ruling. You thought that maybe these 10% tariffs weren't around, and then here we are in the afternoon, less than 24 hours after that, saying, oh, well, the tariffs are back on the table. If you're a small business, how do you plan around that? And I've talked to many small businesses over the last few months that have said, we're okay with the idea of tariffs. In fact, we even agree in some cases with the reasons for why President Trump is doing this, but we would really prefer that he say it's going to be 10% for this year, 10% for the year after, another 10% for the year after, because at this current strategy where you don't know in any given hour what the tariff rates are going to be, you just can't plan for that. That's not good for business, Kristen.
Yeah, it certainly does make it incredibly challenging from that perspective. And I want to ask you about something that I was just talking to Gabe about, which is these negotiations that are underway. The White House saying serious talks with at least 18 countries. Peter Navarro had said 90 deals in 90 days. To what extent does this limit the White House's leverage in these negotiations?
Yeah, well, I mean, it does certainly take away some of the leverage from the United States when you consider if you're putting yourself in the position of a European Union or an India or even China trying to negotiate with the United States. You're saying, well, if the court system even inside the United States is unsure about whether or not these tariffs do have legal standing, well, then you probably don't have as much urgency to want to come to the negotiating table or at least want to ink a deal. So, A, it kind of takes away some of the teeth that the United States might have at the negotiating table, but then it also doesn't really give you any sort of urgency to want to move quick on this. First off, when it comes to most of these 10% tariffs, we have until basically the second week of July to figure this out. The European Union, as we know, that 50% tariff that the president had originally threatened also got pushed back to July 9th. So there's really kind of no urgency here, especially knowing that this appeals decision that was just handed down in the last hour or so means that it's going to take another few weeks to figure out exactly what happens with this. So again, it does change the dynamic slightly here.
Brian Chung, thank you so much, as always, for your insights and analysis. Let's turn now to Timothy Brightbill. Thank you so much for being here. Let me just get your reaction to this latest appeals court decision that, at least temporarily for right now, basically reinstates President Trump's tariffs, right?
That's correct. This is a temporary administrative stay from the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. I think it's notable that it was signed by 11 of the judges, including the chief judge, and it allows for some rapid briefing of the issue over the next 10 days or so. So, yes, it's a temporary stay while they decide what to do next and allow the parties to brief as this issue continues to move forward.
And what do you anticipate is going to happen next? Are we basically seeing a slow-moving or maybe a fast-moving train until this all goes to the Supreme Court? Is that where this ends up?
Well, it's very hard to predict. Trade cases almost never go to the Supreme Court. But I think in this case, the issues are obviously significant enough and important enough that ultimately this will be decided by the Supreme Court. So hard to predict whether a stay will last, whether the tariffs will go in place or not. But at some point, the Supreme Court will weigh in.
And let's just talk for a moment about that ruling by the trade court, which basically temporarily blocked the Trump administration's tariffs. What did you make of that ruling and the implications and, frankly, the backlash that we saw from the White House?
Sure. Well, it's a very significant ruling last night from the U.S. Court of International Trade and a setback for the administration, and certainly another step in what has been a very fast-moving and convoluted trade war. It's the first court ruling setting aside this administration's continued use of tariffs on our trading partners. So very significant in that regard. And I think two things stood out to me, sort of two pillars from the decision. First, the court held that while the president has the power to regulate imports under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, that does not authorize worldwide retaliatory tariffs. And it doesn't authorize the president to impose whatever tariff rates he deems desirable. And then second, while the president declared a national emergency due to an unusual and extraordinary threat due to the fentanyl crisis, the court found that his remedy of tariffs did not address or deal with that threat and emergency. It only provided leverage or negotiations power, which is not what the law requires. So I think a very important decision from the Court of International Trade. Now it all gets reviewed again by the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, and ultimately, I do think, to the Supreme Court.
How do you assess the strength of the case that the Trump administration is making, that they do, in fact, have this emergency authority?
Well, it's interesting. The Court of International Trade is the same court that largely upheld President Trump's China tariffs and national security tariffs in the prior administration. So I think it's very significant that they ruled against the president on these broader tariffs. So we'll just have to see how the appeals court will proceed. And again, ultimately, I think the Supreme Court will have the final word on whether the president does have authority and whether the IEEPA law allows the use of tariffs. Normally, it's used for sanctions, not for tariffs on dozens of countries.
You know, it's interesting. You heard Peter Navarro there at the top of the show say, look, even if we get blocked in the courts, there are other methods that we could use. We are not deterred by the courts trying to block us. What are those other avenues by which they could impose these tariffs? And if they're so confident in those, why not go that route in the first place?
Sure, the president might move ahead with other forms of tariffs. There are several other laws available. So you have Section 301, which was the basis for the China tariffs that are still in effect. You have Section 232, the national security law, which was used for steel and aluminum initially. And there are current investigations going on targeted toward lumber, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, and other industries. So those laws could be used. And there are other laws, such as Section 122, where the president can respond to a balance of payments emergency with tariffs of up to 15%, but that's only for up to 150 days. So it's a real question whether the president will simply fight this appeal or pivot to one of these other laws as a way to impose tariffs.
You know, the president has argued that these tariffs are necessary to level the playing field, to get better trade deals. How do you see this whiplash that we're all watching in the courts impacting those negotiations that are ongoing?
Well, I agree that I think our trading partners would be wise to continue discussions and negotiations. So perhaps the court ruling perhaps limits leverage a little bit. But if I were the United Kingdom or the European Union, Japan, Korea, any of our trading partners, I would continue to negotiate. There are plenty of trade issues to address, plenty of trade barriers to remove if both sides are interested. So I would not use the court rulings as an excuse for stepping away from the negotiating table.
All right, Timothy Brightbill, thank you so much for all of that great information. We really appreciate it. Coming up, Harvard University wins a key fight against the Trump administration over the school's ability to enroll foreign students. But what does the temporary reprieve mean for students now living in limbo and the future of the country's oldest university? We're live in Cambridge with The View from campus. Plus, Secretary of State Marco Rubio puts Chinese students on notice, vowing to revoke certain student visas as Beijing blasts the actions as, quote, politicized and discriminatory. Stay with us. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. It's graduation day at Harvard University, and as commencement ceremonies were underway, lawyers for the Ivy League school won a temporary victory in their ongoing and escalating legal battle with the Trump administration. A federal judge in Boston extended a temporary order blocking the Trump administration from revoking Harvard's ability to enroll international students. That ruling came after the Trump administration said it would give the university 30 days to challenge the revocation. On campus, Harvard University President Alan Garber received a standing ovation as he welcomed all members of the graduating class.
Members of the class of 2025 from down the street, across the country, and around the world. Around the world, just as it should be.
Joining me now from the Harvard University campus is NBC News correspondent Antonia Hilton and former U.S. Attorney and NBC News legal analyst Carol Lamb. Thanks to both of you for being here in this extraordinary story. Antonia, let me start with you. You were there. It was graduation day. What was the atmosphere like on campus today?
Kristen, I have been describing the atmosphere here as celebratory, but also defiant, because I have not found a single student or family member on campus who was not aware of the fact that while they were reflecting on their 4 years as Harvard students here, trying to take pictures with their family members, that there were lawyers just a couple miles down the road going into court to go toe-to-toe with Trump administration lawyers. And, of course, about 27% of the student body here at this school is international. So it's highly personal for more than a quarter of the people who are part of the celebration today. The students who have been, at times, really diametrically opposed to each other, particularly when it comes to the issue of the war in Israel and Gaza, they've now started coming together and uniting around what they say has become an existential threat. Take a listen to a conversation I had with one senior named Leo this morning, right before he processed into graduation.
We are all obviously celebrating our own achievements today for our 4 years, but I think that Trump's threat against Harvard are truly hanging over this, because without the international students, Harvard is not Harvard anymore. And, you know, we might be the last international class in a while. When people come back next semester, there might not be any international students left.
So that's sort of the other piece that's on everyone's mind. So after the party tonight, what actually happens to the 17 and 18-year-olds who are hoping to come here for the first time in the fall? For all our classmates who maybe went home to visit their families in other countries, but are worried that when they come back to the U.S., they could be turned away at the border because something changes in the courts in the coming days. They're grateful for this 30-day window here and that this judge has kept the temporary restraining order in place. But they're very aware, too, that this is going to be a long-term battle, that the Trump administration may make other moves in addition to this one. So that sense of anxiety, Kristen, I think it's going to be here for a while. Yeah, it's just extraordinary to hear that students say we might be the last international class for a while. Antonia, how is the university reacting overall to today's ruling? I would say the vast majority of students, faculty members, leadership here, they're celebrating this as a temporary win. But the real behind-the-scenes conversation, Kristen, is that there is a need to sort of build the endurance for a fight that is going to last 3.5 years. So that means they are marshaling alums to donate sums of money so that certain labs can continue to do their work if they completely lose their federal funding. I have spoken to quantum physics students, people who do genetics and cancer research here, who are worried that the life-saving work that they do may not be able to continue. So there's an effort to figure out, well, how do we keep our academic programs, the sort of lifeblood of the school here and present, while also gathering a team of lawyers who are going to see this school through, because they see it as bigger than just Harvard and really as just the beginning of a broader fight against higher ed. Antonia Hilton, thank you so much for being there on the ground, for your great reporting. We really appreciate it. Carol Lamb, let me head over to you. So just before the hearing started today, we learned that the Trump administration is giving Harvard 30 days to respond to why the government shouldn't revoke the university's ability to enroll international students. Do you view this as an attempt to try to pre-butt whatever the judge ruled today? How do you view that action?
Well, Kristen, let me just say that from a competency in court point of view, this has been a complete embarrassment for the government. When a week ago, the Department of Homeland Security told Harvard, we are revoking your ability to have international students, apparently the government didn't realize that it was in violation of its own regulations. Its own regulations, DHS regulations say you give notice to a university, then they have 30 days to respond, and then it goes through at least 2 levels of appeal within the agency, and that's before you even get to a court. So now Harvard pointed that out in their lawsuit, and now the Department of Homeland Security has had to say essentially, oops, you caught us. Okay, we'll give you your 30 days notice. And they said, go ahead and lift the temporary restraining order. But the judge wasn't having any of that. The judge said, no, I want the status quo to remain. and she left the temporary restraining order there, and she said, you guys can come up with a language for a preliminary injunction, but I am going to enter a preliminary injunction to make sure the status quo remains as is.
Carol, is this case going to go to the Supreme Court, do you think?
I think there's a good possibility it will, because this administration is simply not giving up on what appears to be sort of a temper tantrum against Harvard, and it's going to keep fighting on all of these fronts. And the more chaos it can introduce with respect to the international student community, the happier it appears to be. So even if it loses ultimately down the road, it's happy to have that sort of craziness take place that throws students and faculty and the school off balance. That is, in effect, part of their goal.
Let me ask you about the core argument that Harvard is making, essentially saying that the Trump administration is violating its First Amendment rights. I know you've analyzed how the government is actually carrying out its case, but how strong of a case do you think Harvard has here?
Yeah, Harvard really raised three arguments. One was the argument I've already explained, which is that DHS violated its own rules and regulations, which they've now had to backpedal on. I'm sorry, but DHS has backpedaled on that front. Harvard has also alleged a First Amendment violation that essentially Harvard and its students have the right to express themselves, express different views, express different political views, and essentially what the administration is saying is that we don't like those views, and as a result, we're just going to take this broad brush and say you can't admit any international students. Finally, Harvard also alleges a violation of the Administrative Procedures Act, that this is an arbitrary and capricious act on the part of the administration.
Do you believe, Carol, that this case could actually have an impact on some of the other legal battles, and there are a number of them involving the Trump administration?
Well, a lot of them are intertwined. So the other significant battle that Harvard has going with the administration is this sort of freezing of grants that were promised or were in effect to, by the National Institute of Health and a lot of other federal agencies that fund research at Harvard. And they are making a lot of the same arguments, a lot of them being made in front of the same judge, Judge Burroughs in Boston. So there is an intertwined relationship among all of these cases. And it also does inform the judge as to sort of what the administration's broader attempt is here. And, it gets farther and farther away from their stated justification, which is anti-Semitism and wokeness on the university, what that has to do with funding of critical medical research or scientific research, as Antonia pointed out, is really called into question here.
All right, Carol Lim, thank you so much. We really appreciate your joining us today.
Thank you.
Well, it's not just President Trump's fight with Harvard causing concern for international students. Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced that the U.S. will begin, quote, aggressively revoking the visas of Chinese students with connections to the Chinese Communist Party or who are studying in critical fields. But the administration is providing very few details about how it will determine which students have ties to the Chinese Communist Party or what it defines as a critical field. NBC News international correspondent Janice Mackey-Frayer is in Beijing with the very latest.
It's a huge blow for thousands of Chinese students, as well as a sign that despite that ceasefire of sorts on tariffs, relations between the U.S. and China could be unraveling. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said the State Department will aggressively revoke the visas of Chinese students in the U.S. and increase security for Chinese students trying to get their visas, including those, he said, with connections to the Chinese Communist Party or studying in critical fields. The Department of Homeland Security is revising visa criteria for all international students. This was an order that went to all U.S. embassies globally. But here in Beijing, embassy staff were told to stop taking applications for new visa appointments. Chinese officials responding today saying they lodged a diplomatic protest, calling the move unreasonable and accusing the U.S. of targeting China. Students we've talked to here are fearful. And it's no small detail that Xi Jinping's daughter went to Harvard under a pseudonym. With more than 275,000 Chinese students in the U.S., there is a ripple effect here, not just universities losing revenue, but the wider economy. According to the Association of International Educators, more than 1.1 million international students contributed nearly $44 billion to the economy in the 2023-24 school year, and a good chunk of that was in California. This could also complicate trade talks with China and send anxiety rippling across university campuses in the U.S.
All right, Janice, thank you for that report. Coming up next, all the president's pardons and all the fallout. How the governor of Michigan is responding after President Trump said he would look at potentially pardoning the men who were convicted of plotting to kidnap her. Stay with us. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. It's been a busy week for President Trump's pardon power. The White House yesterday said the president officially signed pardons for reality TV personalities Todd and Julie Chrisley, who were convicted of fraud in 2022. He also signed pardons for former New York Republican Congressman Michael Grimm, who pled guilty to tax fraud. Former Connecticut Republican Governor John Rowland, who pled guilty to conspiracy, and also a commutation for gang leader Larry Hoover, who was serving 6 life sentences. Some of the other notable pardons of Mr. Trump's second term include several individuals and groups of people who claim to be victims of Trump's political enemies. Responding to a question in the Oval Office yesterday, President Trump said he is looking into another pardon for the men who were convicted of trying to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, saying the trail looked to him like, quote, somewhat of a railroad job. The trial looked to him like a railroad job. Governor Whitmer responded earlier today.
Very disappointed that they're even considering it, frankly. When the president was shot at in Pennsylvania, I was one of the first people on either side of the aisle to condemn it. We have to condemn political violence, no matter where it comes from, no matter who it's aimed at. It does a disservice to everyone if we do anything short of that. And so I'll be making my thoughts known to the White House, and I hope they take it into consideration.
Joining me now with the very latest is NBC News White House correspondent Yamiche Alcindor. Yamiche, thanks so much for joining me this afternoon. So what do you make of the fact that there's been so much pardon activity right now? What are your sources telling you about the timing?
Well, Kristen, it's a good question because there is this question of why are all these pardons happening now? And in talking to experts as well as legal analysts, they tell me that this is really about President Trump looking at these pardons as a sort of messaging tool. He's messaging on financial crimes. He's using these pardons to attack his predecessor, former President Biden, in some cases saying that it was Biden's corrupt DOJ that went after people. We saw that in the January 6th pardons, but we also see that in some of these federal crimes. There's also this sense that he's pardoning people that he feels like are supporters of him. So Ed Martin said, no MAGA left behind, meaning no Make America Great Again supporter left behind, Ed Martin being, of course, his pardon attorney. So they're making it very plain that this is not just about sort of who they feel like may have been wrongly convicted, but this is also about political loyalties, which is a very interesting thing for the president to be doing. But he's not being at all sort of trying to hide it. He's being very transparent about the idea that some of these people donated millions of dollars. In one case, it was a man's mother who donated more than $1 million, and then he was pardoned. So that's sort of what we're seeing at the Trump White House, and I expect that we're going to continue to see this.
Yeah, obviously his comments about those who were convicted of plotting to kidnap Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, those comments getting a lot of attention, a lot of pushback, including from the governor herself. What do you make of the fallout, Yamiche, and where does this debate or discussion go from here?
It's interesting. I'm not quite sure where it's going to go from here because you have Gretchen Whitmer, somebody as the governor of Michigan who's come into the White House, had one-on-one meetings with President Trump. Her answer there, I think, was very politically neutral in some ways in that she's saying, look, I was very concerned when someone was after you, and when you face your own assassination attempt, I would hope that you would also take my life seriously when it was threatened by these people. That being said, the fact that President Trump is openly talking about this and the fact that he's saying that these people may have been railroaded, that's definitely giving a lot of people in Michigan, sources that I'm talking to, heart palpitations, because this was a very, very serious plot to kidnap and kill the governor of Michigan. The other thing is, though, that some of this could just, again, be political messaging. So if at some point someone in the Trump administration has the president's ear and convinces him that pardoning these people is going to be like partnering the January 6th rioters, then they might actually be successful in getting this pardon done, Kristen.
All right. Well, I know you will continue to watch it very closely. Yamiche, thank you so much. Great to see you as always. We want to turn now to staffing shakeups at Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The head of ICE Enforcement and Removal Operations, Kenneth Ganalo, is stepping down effective immediately. Sources telling NBC News that Ganalo was given a choice to retire or resign, and he chose retirement. Meantime, the acting head of Homeland Security Investigations is being reassigned to a new role within ICE. His focus is on combating human and drug trafficking and also plays a key role in finding criminal immigrants. This move comes amid growing pressure on ICE from the White House to dramatically ramp up immigrant arrests. Top advisor Stephen Miller and Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem have been pushing ICE to accelerate enforcement actions in line with President Trump's immigration agenda. Coming up after the break, 128 days later, Elon Musk's unceremonious departure from the White House and whether Doge can go on without him. We'll dig into all the politics next. The panel is coming up. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Elon Musk's official time at the White House has come to a close. The architect of the Department of Government Efficiency posted last night, quote, "As my scheduled time as a special government employee comes to an end, I would like to thank President Trump for the opportunity to reduce wasteful spending. The Doge mission will only strengthen over time as it becomes a way of life throughout the government." His final days were not without controversy as Musk slammed Trump's congressional agenda as too pricey and lamented the criticism Doge received in Washington, even as its efforts to cut the size and scope of government came up, well, short of his own expectations. While he was a constant presence at the White House over the first months of the Trump administration, there was no thank you ceremony or even social media posts from the president or the man who once dubbed himself as the first buddy. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt thanked him for his service today. Joining me now on set is Shelby Talcott, White House correspondent for Semaphore. Jennifer Palmieri, White House Communications Director in the Obama administration and advisor on the Hillary Clinton campaign and Kamala Harris campaigns as well. And Stephen Moore, former Trump economic advisor and co-founder of Unleash Prosperity. Thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it. Let's start with Elon Musk, Shelby. So we saw Elon Musk depart unceremoniously and again didn't reach his own goals in terms of what he wanted to cut. And yet he said he actually thinks that Doge is going to continue to be a part of government spending. What do you make of the way that Elon Musk is departing and the potential implications?
I think it was really interesting the way he departed. Just a few weeks ago, he sat down with a small group of reporters at the White House, and that was kind of like his exit interview. I was there for that. And during that hour-long interview with about a dozen reporters, he sort of alluded to the fact that he didn't really reach his initial goal, and he was sort of upset by that, even as he maintained that they had done a lot of good and that Doge would continue. I think the big question that people have is how aggressively is it going to continue? We heard Caroline Leavitt today say that effectively the cabinet members and Trump himself are going to be in charge of implementing these Doge measures. Remember, some of these cabinet members had pushed back on what Elon Musk had wanted to do. So, I think some people in the White House are certainly happy that Doge is now behind them. It caused a lot of negative headlines for them. They're ready to move on to the next thing. But at the same time, this was a really big thing that Donald Trump campaigned on.
It sure was. Stephen, how do you assess Elon Musk's time at the White House? Was Doge, has it been a success?
Yeah, I just wrote a column today on this, and the title was, did Elon Musk drain the swamp or drown in it? And I think it might be the latter. And, I'm really saddened by that. I think what Elon Musk did was pretty heroic. I mean, he came in, he identified a lot of the hundreds of billions of dollars of waste and fraud and thievery that happens in the federal government. And I had high hopes for this. I'm a fiscal hawk. I wanted to see a lot of these reforms put in place. He did do a lot to try to get federal workers back on the job, which I think was a good thing 4 years after COVID. But You could say, you're right. You know, you said disappointed. I would say frustrated. I think he's frustrated that he wasn't able to accomplish more. And without him at the helm, I don't know what the future is of Doge. But, you know, when you're losing $2 trillion a year, it makes a lot of sense to try to find the waste and inefficiency. And he did find a lot of it. But you're right. Congress doesn't seem to be much interested in doing anything about it.
Yeah, and I do want to follow up on that point. Jen, before we do, let's talk about the Democrats' reaction to Elon Musk, because I've had conversations where you have some Democrats saying, look, we should have him at the centerpiece of our ads for the midterms. We should continue to make him the boogeyman. Is that smart politically, or do Democrats need to move on?
I just don't think that he's a compelling enough figure. If he is not going to be at the center of the Trump White House, he's a compelling enough figure to, you know, orchestrate the 2026 midterms around. I do think, I mean, if you wanted to accomplish what Stephen said that he should set out to do, you need more than 6 months. You know, you need to do that in a thoughtful way. You need to do that. You need to do that in coordination with Congress. And I think that, I mean, I've seen enough focus groups to know what came out of it. It's just a sense of chaos. And also, hey, we need people in government who know what they're doing, and you can't just, you know, with like the, you know, you can't just with a pen decide you're going to like oust people. That's not like that is kind of what I think ultimately broke through.
Stephen, speaking of Congress and Congress's role here, they are trying to pass the so-called big, beautiful bill. And Elon Musk says it can either be big or beautiful, but it cannot be both. Yeah, I mean, he's very critical of it on his way out the door. What do you make of that and the implications for whether it can get through both chambers?
Oh, it's going to happen. I bet the odds are about 80%.
You're that confident?
Yeah.
Okay.
It will. I mean, this is the sausage-making factory we're talking about. So, you know, sometimes it's ugly to look at. And the reason I can say with a high degree of confidence it's going to happen is because it has to happen. You know, we can't allow taxes to go up $4 trillion next year. Look, I think this was Elon Musk just saying, where's the Doge savings in this budget? Because they aren't there. And I am someone who wants to see the government downsized. I want to see, you know, movement towards a balanced budget. But they're just, you know, the federal government was supposed to spend $87 trillion in the next 10 years. Under this budget, it spends $85 trillion. That's hardly a lean budget.
You know, Jen, Stephen's pretty confident there. Democrats are going to go after their argument. Yeah. They're going to say that this ultimately will cut Medicaid. Right. Is that going to be enough to chip away at some support around the edges?
I don't know. I mean, it may be, and there's a lot. This process, the reconciliation process, is tedious and long and hard. So it may be problematic for them down the road, but either way, there's trouble if they understand the trouble in their party if they don't act. There's a lot of things in that bill that are pretty unpopular that will be a problem for them politically if they do act.
Well, we'll watch how it all plays out. The backdrop to all of this, Shelby, is President Trump's tariff policy. There's been a fair amount of whiplash on that, from the courts to his own policies imposing tariffs and then pulling them back. A Financial Times columnist coined the word taco, which stands for Trump always chickens out, when describing how the markets react to how Trump makes and then pauses his tariff threats. He was actually directly asked about this yesterday. Let's look at how he responded.
Chicken out. I've never heard that. You mean because I reduced China from 145% that I set down to 100 and then down to another number? And I said you have to open up your whole country. And because I gave the European Union a 50% tax tariff, and they called up and they said, please, let's meet right now. Please, let's meet right now. We had a dead country. We had a country people didn't think it was going to survive, and you ask a nasty question like that. It's called negotiation.
Clearly did not like the question there, but he's very dug in on his tariff policy. We heard that from Peter Navarro today, despite these legal challenges.
Yeah, and we've heard from the White House, and they've noted that just because of these legal setbacks, that doesn't mean that there's not other ways that they can implement tariffs, and that's exactly what they're planning on doing. Just like the legal setbacks with immigration, they're still deporting people under different measures. But, you know, I think the big thing for the White House has been this sort of whiplash, has been the ultimate question over what is the point of the tariffs. Is it going to produce revenue for the U.S., which the White House says, or is it a negotiation? I think there's questions over whether it can be both, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, Stephen, what do you make of how the president's carrying out his tariff policy, do you think he's being careful enough in some of these instances to get what he says he wants, which are these deals done with other countries?
I mean, the one thing about this taco, Trump always chickens out, is that I think a lot of people in the media still don't get Trump. I mean, this is vintage Trump negotiating strategy. He always starts out with a huge number. It was right out of the deal, and then he retreats from that. That's not him, chickening out, and it's just putting his firm offer on the table. This court decision is going to have to change the strategy. Some of the tariffs are going to probably prevail under the law. Some of them aren't, and that puts Trump in a little. He was using these tariffs as a leverage negotiating tool, and now the courts have taken that away from him. So we'll see whether he can cut these deals now.
Jen, when I talk to Democrats, they say the courts are really our strongest point of leverage that we have to counter Trump right now. Is that how you see it? As they, obviously there has been a lot of opposition to how he's carrying out his tariffs.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when Trump controls the White House, when MAGA Republicans control the Congress, the courts are the only leverage that you have. And I think there was a lot of concern early on that you could not count that the courts would not be ruling in the ways that they are. Every law firm that's gone to court
two of those justices were Republicans.
Right. They are backing up. They are backing up the law until you get to until you have things to actually fight over, like the reconciliation bill. Like 2026. That's the best leverage we have. Is the courts.
Yeah. Do you see this going to the Supreme Court?
Sorry?
Quickly, do you see this fight going to the Supreme Court?
I don't know. I'm not confident that Trump would necessarily win in the Supreme Court on this one because they're originalists, and the Constitution is pretty clear. Tax bills start in the House.
Yeah,
but they're okay with it going to the Supreme Court.
The Trump administration.
They want almost all of these. They would be okay with going to the Supreme Court because it's their best chance.
This is the fight they want. Yeah. All right, guys. Thank you. Great conversation. Shelby, Jen, and Stephen, really appreciate it. And still to come, the U.S. military escalates its crackdown on transgender troops in the Army. We are live at the Pentagon with new reporting that you don't want to miss. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. The Army is announcing a new policy solidifying that transgender soldiers are disqualified from service. The Army put out an order detailing the new discharge policy for what it calls gender dysphoria disqualification and separation from service. The order requires commanders to update soldiers' records to reflect biological sex assigned at birth, not gender identity. That means in their final days of service, transgender troops will be forced to live as the sex they no longer identify as before being retired from the Army as a different sex than they served. The order comes in the wake of President Trump's January executive order banning transgender people from serving the military and a Supreme Court ruling upholding that order earlier this month. NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube joins me now from outside the Pentagon. Court, thanks so much for being here. So what more do we know about the way the Army is enacting this transgender ban?
Yeah, so, I mean, this is pretty much in keeping with going all the way back to January when President Trump first issued the executive order that talked about how transgender service members would no longer be able to serve. Now, a few weeks later, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth released a large memo that essentially laid out those guidelines, but then it was up to the services to sort of figure out the specifics. Well, the Army has come out, as you mentioned, late yesterday with what they call a FRAGO, a fragmentation order. Basically, that is Army-wide guidance about how to carry out a new policy in a very practical way. A lot of this stuff is not surprising. We knew, according to the earlier guidance, that the Army was going to say that service members are going to have to serve in their birth sex, the sex that they were born at. But what we did not know until this order came out, Kristen, is that individuals who have already identified themselves as either being transgender or having gender dysphoria, thereby disqualifying them from continuing to serve in the Army, that their their sex would also revert in their personnel records, meaning that even though they've already identified, even though they're most likely on administrative leave, their remaining days in the military, they will have to serve in the sex they were born at and not necessarily the one that they had been serving in the Army, no matter how long they had been in. And why that's also really important is they will also separate from the military, so all their military separation or retirement records will also indicate their birth sex and not necessarily the one that they had been serving in, Kristen.
Court, I think a lot of people are curious about how many people we're talking about here. How many people does this actually impact?
So military officials say it's about 200 so far, individuals who have come forward and voluntarily identified themselves as either, again, being transgender or having either gender dysphoria diagnosis or having some of the characteristics or the symptoms of gender dysphoria. There are likely others who are in the Army more than that. We don't know an exact number, but estimates are there higher than 200 who may have to be essentially discovered by the Army. Now, remember, their commanders can see some of their medical history and their medical records. So it is possible that after this first deadline, others could be identified and then involuntarily separated.
Courtney Kube, as always, thank you so much. We appreciate your joining us. We are back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now, but the news continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.